Good afternoon, and welcome to our Black History Month event. We're delighted to have you. I'm Cynthia Gandy-Zinneber from the Henry Plant Museum, and this all started because we are having a very exciting show next month on Booker T. Washington's visit to the Tampa Bay Casino here on site in 1912. By the way, the casino was never for gambling. It was always for performing arts, and Charles was probably going to tell you that anyway. I want to thank some of the other groups that were very instrumental in making this happen. The Bias Education Resource Team, Black Student Union, the Student Government, Success Scholars Program, and the Dean of Students Office, especially Dr. Stephanie Russell-Krebs. So now I'm going to ask Charles and Rodney to begin with Music and Memory, the role of spirituals in Booker T. Washington's Florida Educational Tour. Dr. Charles McGraw Groh and Dr. Rodney Shores. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay with the mask on? Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just go ahead and dive right into this. In March of 1912, Booker T. Washington embarked on a speaking tour of Florida. There was a special Pullman car that allowed his party of Black educators, physicians, ministers, and business leaders to travel through the state with dignity and comfort. This private car was necessary because Florida law at the time mandated separate cars for Black and white passengers, and the normal train line did not provide first-class service to African Americans. So for the party to be able to actually engage in this tour, there had to be separate accommodations made. Now, as a lot of you know, Booker T. Washington was founder and principal of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, and he became a leading voice for civil rights in the United States. He advocated a strategy of long-term Black advancement through industrial education, business ownership, and the creation of separate Black institutions. A lot of people don't know that he also secretly funded test case litigation to restore Black political rights, but his dependence on white donors and the realities of apartheid in Alabama prevented him from acknowledging these efforts publicly. So you notice that we want to talk with you today about spirituals. Spirituals and other traditional songs featured prominently in the program that Washington and his traveling party presented at different stops around the state: Pensacola, Tallahassee, Tampa, Jacksonville, and elsewhere. What I want to draw your attention to is that while the white and Black segments of the audience listened to the same music, they had very different interpretations of what they heard. And I'm fascinated by this because I think this disconnect really offers a window into race relations in cities like Tampa during Jim Crow segregation. At the same time, it also provides an opportunity to talk about the evolution of Black music in American popular culture. So Washington's party arrived in Tampa on March 4th. They discovered a city that was increasingly divided by race. A law passed by the Florida legislature in 1905 had segregated streetcars. A few years earlier, the Florida Democratic Party had restricted its membership to whites. Since there was really only one dominant party, this essentially removed African Americans from voting at the state level. For a time, African Americans continued to participate in city politics in Tampa, but in 1908, excuse me, the city council fraudulently removed attorney Zachariah Green as a candidate for municipal judge. Green would be the last black candidate for municipal office in Tampa for several decades. That same year, the creation of Tampa's white municipal party completely removed African Americans from city electoral politics. As the city expanded in the period, black residents found themselves to be excluded from hospitals, schools, and a variety of public services. So now we have this visit. Washington's 1912 tour was sponsored by the Florida branch of the National Negro Business League, but there was a local committee of black community members who planned specifically the Tampa itinerary. The reception committee chose the Tampa Bay Casino as the venue for Washington's speech. So that's already been introduced to you, the casino. I believe it was located pretty much where the Southward Family Building is now, right? So the casino had opened on the grounds of the Tampa Bay Hotel in 1896. It boasted world-class musical performances, theatrical productions. For our purposes, what's important is that the city acquired the casino when it purchased the hotel from the estate of Henry Plant in 1904. The reception committee that was headed by Georges Middleton rented the casino and then petitioned the city council to attend Washington's speech. And it's really clear that these actions asserted the inclusion of black citizens in Tampa's public sphere at a time period where they were being pushed out, okay? So that's why they chose this particular venue. Unfortunately, this strategy also meant that they had to adhere to strict Jim Crow regulations. Black and white residents in Tampa purchased their tickets in separate locations, and the auditorium had segregated seating. The casino staff also placed sheeting between white and black sections of the theater, but Washington refused to begin the program until the sheeting was removed. Right. So Washington's speech at the Tampa Bay Casino reflected his approach to securing black advancement in the Jim Crow South. He showed tremendous deference to the whites in the audience. He offered praise in his speech for what he described as really the majority of white citizens who he said worked tirelessly to create a climate of racial harmony. This was a common rhetorical strategy for Washington. If you actually listen carefully to his remarks, as black members of the audience would have done, he also offered a rebuke for the horrific acts of lynching that were all too common in Florida at this time. The main subject of his address was convincing whites of the need to expand black educational and occupational opportunities for African Americans in Tampa. His argument hinged on the reassurance that neither of these endeavors threatened white supremacy. His speech was received enthusiastically from whites and from blacks in Tampa. Not surprisingly, they emphasized very different parts of his remarks. As I mentioned, music was part of the program, as it was in all of Washington's formal tour stops. The consistent feature is the gentleman that you're looking at, Robert Russell Moten, who was commandant of cadets at the Hampton School. And what he did was to lead the black segment of the audience in singing two spirituals. One you'll hear today, In Bright Mansions, and the second, Until I Reach My Home. Now, this was consistent throughout the stops in Florida. What appears to be specific to Tampa was that a quartet of local young men came next. We don't know the specific songs, only that they were familiar to the African Americans who were in attendance. The music took place after a series of introductions, and then immediately afterward, that's when Washington spoke. So it's easy to explain the ease with which the black audience participated in the program. Churches furnished the building blocks of free black communities, and their cultural practices influenced most forms of association. Some of the first African American churches in Tampa, and I've given you examples here of churches that are actually profiled in our exhibit. So I'm not saying that they're the first church, okay? But some of the earliest churches, Beulah Baptist, which was established in 1865, St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was established in 1870, provided a lot more than religious fellowship to black residents at this time. As the first institutions, they provided political meeting space, they provided schooling, they provided job referrals, they provided a range of social services, and the practices that structured worship, collective call and response, emotion and experience as authentic ways of knowing, active participation by everyone. All of these practices carried over into those other domains that I mentioned. A political meeting, right? Something that relates to jobs. And this practice continued even after the creation of secular institutions. So audience participation, especially singing, made sense to the African Americans who gathered at the Tampa Bay Casino to hear Washington speak. Whites, though, found these collective black voices to be extraordinary. And Florida newspapers, the reaction was pretty much the same at each stop. It wasn't specific to Tampa. Florida newspapers gave disproportionate attention to the musical section of the program, okay? I described the length when I talked about Tampa, right? There's a lot of discussion of this in the white press. And they tend to characterize the music as plantation melodies, to use their language. And when you read the accounts, they're very much steeped in a romanticized remembrance of the Old South that became popular during Jim Crow, this period of very rigid segregation. Images of happy slaves singing and working in unison were a kind of common feature in this white racial fantasy. Central to this depiction, and I really want to emphasize this to you, was a contrast between past and present. So the idea was that in the present, you have what they characterize as discontented, uppity, lazy, black Tampans. And then compared to that, we have this pastoral ideal of slavery where everybody seems to be happy, right? They're very content with the racial order. And the frequency with which these comparisons are made, I think, make it very obvious how frequently African Americans like Zachariah Green are challenging the strictures imposed by Jim Crow, right? Somebody has to be challenging you for you to constantly be talking about somebody being uppity, okay? So I think that's the important thing to take away from this. Now, where we're standing right now, in the Tampa Bay Hotel, there was packaged a version of plantation memory that was designed for the consumption of northern tourists. So when we look at the rise of the luxury resort industry in Florida that's associated with Henry Plant and Henry Flagler on the other coast in the 1880s and 1890s, it coincided with the national popularity of remembrance culture, some of the imagery that I've been talking to you about. And hotels drew on this very distorted image of pre-Civil War society to kind of present this image of like the grace and refinement of aristocratic slaveholders and the labor of their happy slaves. So the example that I'm giving you here is one that we've profiled in an earlier exhibit. Managers at the Tampa Bay Hotel expected the wait staff to join other African American employees in entertaining guests through the staging of elaborate minstrel shows. The performance combined musical numbers with self-deprecating jokes, comedic antics, that white racial fantasies associated with slave culture. You're looking at waiters who appeared as the famous Tampa Bay Quartet, singing, and I quote, delightful plantation melodies in concerts that became fixtures of the hotel's calendar. The actual image that you're looking at comes from a national magazine, Leslie's Weekly, in 1898, that devoted a page to a northern tourist fascination with the singing group. The publication promised an authentic look at, and I quote, the happy side of darky life to vacationers who were able to, had the means, wealth, to travel to Florida. So you have the photo, you're told it's a quartet, right? The fifth individual is a waiter who's dressed as a slave. And under the guise of Billy Green, he invited white audiences to, participate in this, right? To take their proper place at the top of this imagined plantation society. Now, the popularity of these images led some black activists at the national level to seek reform of the church itself, to limit practices that they themselves associated with black tradition, slave culture, and then also to limit performances of traditional music in public. You're looking at a photograph of Mary Church Terrell, who was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, later the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and she argued that women who, and I'm going to quote her, shout, holler, or dance during church services perpetuated negative images of black womanhood. Now, scholars who study Terrell, obviously recognize that there's a class bias in her representation of African American worship. But I think it's really important to remember that the movement that she was a part of, the National Women's Club movement, had its origins in the fact that the dominant culture denied any respectability to black women. And the reality was they faced slander, abuse, sexual assault, right? And so the extreme focus that she put on how people behaved was designed to, in some way, combat that. She was one of several prominent activist women in the period who advocated mimicking white forms of solemn religious observance and abandoning more emotionally charged forms of church worship, including those associated with song, in order to claim female respectability. Now, I want to emphasize that in the context of church, in the context of the time period, the leadership of the NAACW, their characterization of the AME and other churches, very much a minority opinion. Very much a minority opinion. Most African Americans in this period preferred more participatory forms of worship, emotional forms of worship, than what she is presenting. But I think the concern that she expressed helps explain why some black activists and newspapers did not welcome the public performance of spirituals. Okay? And that's what I want to turn to for just my last couple of minutes here. When we talk about the public performance of spirituals, we have to talk about the pioneers of that, the Fisk University Jubilee Singers. And over time, it's really clear that in the public domain, they contributed to a more respectful representation of black music in popular culture. In 1871, the student chorus who became known as the Jubilee Singers performed spirituals in concert halls, white churches, in order to raise revenue for their school. If you are unfamiliar with them, Definitely something to look into. There's a great PBS documentary. They became internationally famous. These 3 tours that last until 1878, the United States and Europe, are really just extraordinary, incredibly popular. But again, I think there's 2 things that I would emphasize. In terms of popular culture, this is a huge shift from what whites were used to in these kinds of venues, which is minstrel performances. So the shift is really dramatic. Right? At the same time, it's also really clear that the consumer was white. Right? It's really noteworthy that scholars have found a lack of support for the Fisk singers in newspapers like the Indianapolis Freeman, other kinds of sources. And so it's unclear how much of this reflects a kind of negative association, such as what I described with Terrell, and then how much it also reflects a negative association with the changes that were made to the performance of the music to be in these locations, which is something that Dr. Shores can actually speak to better than I can. But the same phenomenon is true if we turn our attention to the sound recordings that were taking place around the same time that Washington was in Tampa. Beginning in 1909, the Victor Talking Machine Company began recording a quartet from the Fisk University Jubilee Singers. Apparently it had to be a male quartet because of the sound technology. Male voices carried over better, and it had to be a small number because they're literally singing into a horn, okay? But in any case, the initial interest, again, is white consumers. These records really sold, okay? Everything we know from the records of these early companies, Victor, Edison, finally Columbia, says that they were selling to whites. But again, there's a huge departure here because the earlier lines of what they called black music had very derogatory names, clearly associated with minstrels. And this is something that they market as folk music, right? So a very, very different characterization. Now, the last thing that I'll point out to you here as I conclude is that we do see a shift in the black embrace of the Fisk singers as part of the New Negro movement. And so what I'm referring to here was a strategy that started with civil rights activists after World War I. W.E.B. Du Bois, National Urban League leader Charles Johnson, were very much promoting artistic expression as a way of actually improving the status of black Americans, okay? So a strategy to really kind of create positive public opinion, right? Through disseminating the arts, black arts. Most people are familiar with this in terms of how it channels into the Harlem Renaissance, okay? I'm kind of interested in this because their original idea was to confine themselves to music that they saw as being most palatable to whites, or artistic forms that would be most palatable to whites. But the artists kind of give this a life of its own. And so it leads to the development of this New Negro movement, which is very much focused on the authenticity of black expression, embraces a variety of different forms, and then also becomes an expression of race pride that works its way into various movements in the context of the 1920s. Okay? How does this mostly affect us? Well, Alan Locke, who you're seeing here, who is one of the principal architects of this movement, along with James Weldon Johnson, wrote extensively about the Jubilee Singers, and more broadly about spirituals as the original form of American musical expression. So the New Negro movement really kind of takes up the spiritual as something that all Americans need to see as our central form of folk culture, right? It's the only thing that's uniquely American. And so that argument really becomes a kind of dominant one in the context of the New Negro movement. For us, I think it's a nice footnote to tell you that Alan Locke, a very young Alan Locke, was in the Tampa Beach Casino for the Washington speech in 1912, right? So he was part of that initial thing that I introduced to you. I'll also tell you that the Fisk University singers actually become a constant feature of the hotel in the 1920s. And again, the reception that they received, far different from that accorded the music that was sung in 1912. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to Dr. Shores.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. The first song we'll be briefly exploring today is one that Dr. Groh had mentioned, In Bright Mansions Above. And we don't know a lot about this piece because, like all spiritual melodies and texts, they were kind of grown. They weren't composed. They kind of evolved over time in various traditions in the slave environment. And often in religious services, we do know that one of the first renderings of this piece shows up in a collection of music called Slave Songs of the United States, first published in 1867, in which the words were in the mansions above. And it was very standard that actually texts like that would change over time and evolve. Now, even though it was first published in 1867, we know that melody and that text had been around for some time. This was just the first time that it had been codified in this way. And do note the spelling here. Good Lord, in the mansions above. So notice that there's some dialect that's actually encoded in the printing here. So that we know for sure that this song, In Bright Mansions Above, went through as many iterations as there were actually groups that sang it, as there were churches that sang it, as there were different ways in which it was sung. And so that's just the way spirituals evolved. The harmonies were actually improvised. And so you notice in the printed form of the music here, there's just a melody, because that was the only thing that seems to have been consistent. People who sang this tune in church would actually make up harmonies as they went along. And one single turn from one singer would change the course of the harmonic structure, largely or to a small degree, depending on the church service, for that moment. So harmonies couldn't be written down because the melody was the only thing that was the same. But as Dr. Groh was pointing out, after the Civil War, a new concept had arisen. It was a concept that was known as what we call today the concert spiritual. As Dr. Groh also pointed out, was made famous by the Fisk University Jubilee Singers and others. But as was pointed out, the singers went on tour from 1871 to 1875 throughout the United States and throughout Europe, trying to raise money for Fisk University. And it was the sense that the concert spiritual was a way in which they could make the spiritual more palatable to the everyday person. Perhaps maybe we could interpret that to mean to white people. And so what this concert spiritual was a device in which the actual original melody was utilized as the base material. And the improvisatory, harmonic making up as you go along, free-form kind of singing, a composer or arranger would attempt to codify or to put down on paper a real fixed form of what that would be like, right? And of course, that structure became very, very highly westernized, using Western principles of harmonic progression and voice leading and that sort of thing. And they wound up being some very, very beautiful, beautiful arrangements. Yet, some of those more creative, inspirational, in-the-moment, expressive, improvised moments seemed to be lost, no matter how hard composers would try to actually get those written down on paper. Some of those things just can't be written down. The rhythms were just too rounded, and when we print musical rhythms, they tend to be very square and metrical, right? And so some things were lost, other things were really kind of gained, but that's part of what we kind of explore as we go. The arrangement of bright mansions that you're going to hear, or the setting of In Bright Mansions Above, that the University Chorus actually sang for this video, is a very modern version of Bright Mansions. It's very contemporary. As you see, it's just entitled Bright Mansions. It's arranged by K. Lee Scott, again, a contemporary composer. And a very interesting thing for us is that all of the dialect that would have been included that you saw in that first melodic page, all of the dialect has been written out. So you don't see any of that. The harmonies have been written in a very luscious, sentimental way, kind of drawing out feelings of emotion, of yearning, of maybe sentimentality for loved ones who've gone on before. And so with that theme, one of the things that we were able to explore during our unit of study in University Chorus the last 3 semesters was the notion that this music was music that not only kind of was religious, but got the worshiper through the craziness of what it meant to be a slave. And craziness is, of course, an understatement to the nth degree. This extraordinarily oppressed group of people who suffered the lash, injustice, all of the horrible things that we think of, found strength and courage and mettle, like just the willpower to actually live another day, in music like Bright Mansions. But it's really, really important to remember that while they found this strength in one area, like thinking about the hope of actually making it to heaven when they died, they found hope, strength, and courage at a secondary level too, because the music never had just one meaning. The music always had a secondary and perhaps more important meaning. One that besides getting up yonder to heaven when we die, we were actually speaking of hopefully making it up yonder north of the Mason-Dixon, where we could actually experience real life freedom with our loved ones who had made it out before us, right? So not just heaven when we die, but a real strong hope of actually making it into real life freedom in this day and time. In the arrangement you're about to hear, you'll hear the text, "In bright mansions above, Lord, I want to live up yonder, in bright mansions above." And that was really, really strong verbiage, as you can imagine, if you're working as a slave on a plantation. And so the next line, you'll hear the tenors and basses sing, "My father's gone before me. I want to go there too." And then you'll hear the sopranos and altos sing of their mothers who've gone before. They want to go, and then the yearning to be up yonder. So here again is that theme of deliverance, not just from the pain of suffering on as a slave on the plantation, but of actually the pain of life in general and being delivered in heaven when we die, but also the idea that we will be reunited in a new world, in a new land, where maybe I'll even be able to own property. Maybe I will even be able to own a home one day. Are we all good?
Just want to share your video.
Oh, very, very cool. So, I just want to say one thing before we actually do get to sharing the video. This has been an extraordinary year or so for musicians who are singers and ensembles too. You're actually going to see this video recorded just across the way in the music room last semester, where we're pretty sure the Fisk University Jubilee Singers actually sang on several occasions. And it's possible that they even sang this song. There's an album title that they have modern day that's actually called In Bright Mansions. But what you're going to see in there is a pared down group from the University Chorus. We've had to divide our ensembles into much smaller groups. They stand 12 feet apart with funny singers' masks that make them look like giant human ducks. And so their rehearsal time, literally because of COVID space restrictions, has been reduced to about 1/6 of the time. In spite of these obstacles, our students here at UT found such love and joy in this music as we've been studying the history, musicianship, and all of the things that go into these spirituals. They've made some really, really lovely music. So we feel a very, very strong connection to this piece, especially since it was sung during Booker T. Washington's visit because of the history in the music room right next door. So the second song that we'll be listening to today is William Dawson's setting of Ain't It That Good News. And I guarantee a few people in the room know that tune. We don't know much about it. It does not show up in any of these early published collections of plantation songs or slave music in any place. But we do know by the time William Dawson set it to music in the 1960s, it had been very much a staple of worship in various churches across the country. And so we do know a few things about William Dawson. Dawson was born in 1899 and ran away from home at age 13 to attend the Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, which, as Dr. Groh had mentioned, was founded in 1881 by Booker T. Washington. He graduated in 1921, went on to an all-white school to do his BA in music, and then on to the Chicago Conservatory of Music to do a master's degree. After a little stint of teaching in the Kansas City public school system, he was invited back to Tuskegee to become a full music professor, and there he helped found the music school and the Tuskegee the Tuskegee Institute Chorus, which is still kind of the defining choir for his arrangements today. Dawson was a composer of many forms of music, including symphony music, chamber music, choral music, etc. But he was always known for the fact that he included these African American melodies that were considered to be, as Dr. Groh mentioned, America's earliest form of music. He included that in all of his composition. And while perhaps his grandest scale work was a work called the Negro Folk Symphony, as you can see here in the slide, recorded by Stokowski, and that actually placed Dawson in the ranks with other great American composers like Aaron Copland and Charles Ives in really solidifying the American form of symphony. Besides this being a really major work that Dawson composed, he is still best known for his concert spiritual arrangements. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out before I actually play the second piece. Even though this arrangement is a formally composed piece, there are several elements that Dawson tries to include from those more free-formed, improvisatory, in-the-moment kind of worship settings. And so, first thing that I want you to think of is the tradition of call and response that you heard Dr. Groh mention. It's very standard that there would be a soloist that would call out a theme, the congregation would respond. The soloist would call out a theme again, the congregation would respond. And over time, that call and response developed the tradition of everyone joining in and singing kind of a refrain, a set refrain or a chorus in parts. And so in Ain't It That Good News, you'll hear first the soprano section sing, I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't it that good news? Then you'll hear the rest of the choir respond, ain't it that good news? The call will go out again, I got a crown up in the kingdom, so forth. And the choir will respond, ain't it that good news? And then you will hear this chorus refrain that always comes back, I'm gonna lay down this world, gonna shoulder up my cross. Now, in addition to this, there was one of those sneaky traditions that Dr. Groh had mentioned earlier that went out of vogue in most black churches because it was considered to be not cool. But there's a tradition that had emerged even as early in African folk cultures that was called a ring shout. And this transferred over into Christian worship as Christianity was introduced to African Americans. And so the tradition was that they would stand in a circle and dance and sing in a very rhythmic and excited tradition. And that dance would increase in volume and intensity and in tempo, faster and faster, until worshipers would actually pass out from exhaustion. And Dawson tries to include this at the end of Ain't It That Good News. You will hear the building and excitement. But again, it becomes a little bit square because it's written down and there's some ridiculous conductor flailing his arms trying to keep everyone in tempo in the music room because we're 12 feet apart wearing duck masks. But that's the attempt of Dawson to include that. Secondly, I'd like to point out that I mentioned in Bright Mansions that there was no dialect included. And Dawson goes out of his way to include certain pieces of dialect. And that is one of the stickiest issues that choral musicians encounter today. No one's quite sure what to do with dialect. So it was really, well, before I say that, presumably Dawson had heard this song and many other worship songs sung in his childhood in black churches growing up, and it was a part of his DNA. And he deliberately chooses to include the dialect here. Now, as Dr. Groh was saying, it was really important that nothing be written in this music that would in any way demonstrate anything less than nobility in these songs. As was pointed out, there were plenty of times when black music was portrayed as being comical, witty, in a sense of mockery, or for the sake of like making somebody feel better about themselves, right? But the composers that were writing these concert spirituals were doing anything but that. And so it becomes a very, very detailed and interesting issue to consider what parts of dialect are we going to keep and what parts of dialect are just insensitive and jerky, right? And so that's always one of the big issues that has to be discussed in any choral setting. And without getting too detailed about what that means, I just want to point out that you'll notice ain't a that and up there and things like the letter D instead of the theta sound, the TH sound. These are some of the things that occupy nerdy choir musicians' discussions today, right? We just have to give thought to them. And we here at UT make no pretense to knowing like what the right answer is. We just know that there are issues of historicity, there are issues of respect and dignity. There are all of those things that were brought to the students' attention as we were exploring this really, really wonderful form of music over the last several semesters. And so what I'd like to leave you with today is just University Chorus's rendition of William Dawson's Ain't a That Good News.
Thank you both so much. I don't think there's anything quite as uplifting as music, and I'm feeling excited. I think we have a few lunches back there remaining. If you have some colleagues back in your office or a roommate that might enjoy having one, please pick it up and take it with you. Thank you again.